Welcome to Short Movie Channel. We begin our movie with a car showroom employee named Dan, who is trying to convince a customer to buy a car. He successfully persuades him, and after work, Dan heads home, where we meet his wife, Jessica, and his daughter, Nina. Nina works as a journalist and is in love with someone from another country, but her family disapproves of the relationship. We also meet Kyle, the son who loves video games. However, his father forbids him from playing out of concern for him. Despite this, Kyle tricks his father by claiming he's going to study at his friend Samir's house, but instead, he goes to play video games. Kyle turns out to be exceptionally talented, so much so that everyone his age talks about how skilled he is at the game. Later on, Dan and Jessica go to an amusement park to celebrate their 18th wedding anniversary. Dan chooses this location because it was where they first met. During the celebration, Dan suggests spending some quality time together, but Jessica expresses her desire to travel with the family, an idea Dan rejects because he's overly cautious about their safety. While at the amusement park, they encounter a group of young men taking random pictures, and Dan and Jessica appear in one of them. Dan politely asks one of the guys to delete the photo, explaining that it's a private moment, but the young man rudely refuses. He then reveals that he used to have a crush on Jessica and is jealous because she chose Dan over him. To provoke Dan further, the guy pours juice on him. However, Dan doesn't react and simply walks away. On their way home, Jessica tries to lighten Dan's mood with jokes, but he remains quiet and upset. Once home, he takes a shower, clearly troubled by the incident. The next day, Jessica is seen training in a boxing class, where she meets a woman named Gwen, who has come from another country to meet her boyfriend. Jessica opens up to Gwen about Dan, describing him as an amazing man but also very routine-oriented and reluctant to travel. While she appreciates his protective nature, she admits that she feels stuck and wishes they could travel and change their lifestyle. Before Gwen leaves for her flight, she gives Jessica her contact card, encouraging her to call if Dan ever agrees to travel. Later, we see Dan with his son Max at the grocery store. Dan notices a man following them. Suddenly, the man attacks, and they engage in a fierce fight while Dan tries desperately to protect Max. Despite the attacker showing no mercy, Dan manages to overpower him. He quickly gets into the car with Max and drives home, visibly shaken. At home, Dan goes to the staircase, where he presses a hidden button that reveals a secret compartment containing a bag filled with money, weapons, and old passports from when Kyle was just a child. Dan then visits a friend who specializes in forging passports, and asks him to create new ones for his kids. Although his friend initially hesitates, he agrees after Dan offers him $500,000 and an apartment. From their conversation, we learn that Dan was once a hitman. Dan begins preparing everything for his family's safety. He goes to Nina's workplace only to discover that she quit her job 3 months ago. Determined to find her, he questions one of her coworkers, who refuses to disclose any information until he gives her $100. With the money in hand, she immediately tells Dan where Nina is. And so, he goes to her, and when Nina sees him, she's shocked and asks how he knew she was there. He tells her, "There's no time to explain. Let's go to your brother at the chess club." He asks where it is and insists she takes him there. When Nina asks what's going on, he tells her he's planning a surprise for the whole family. Nina has no choice but to admit that Kyle isn't at the chess club, so she takes him to Samir's house. When they arrive, he sees Samir and asks where Kyle is. Samir responds by telling him the truth. Kyle has been playing video games and paying Samir to let him use his room. However, Dan doesn't care about anything except getting them to leave. As they're heading to Jessica, Dan notices a car following them. When they reach Jessica's workplace, a physical therapy clinic, Dan tells her he's planned a surprise for her, a trip. Jessica is overjoyed at the news. Meanwhile, Dan notices the car that was following them is still parked outside. Dan tries to shake off the people tailing him. He runs quickly and uses his skills to evade them. During his escape, he discovers a tracking device attached to his car, removes it, and comes up with a plan to ditch them by switching to another car. Afterward, he takes everyone's phones and throws them away to prevent tracking. Dan tells them the purpose of the trip is to spend quality time together as a family, without technology. Meanwhile, someone breaks into Dan's house and smashes his photo. This person turns out to be McCaffrey, a former associate of Dan's. Dan left his job with McCaffrey after marrying Jessica to live a peaceful life, but McCaffrey seeks revenge. Once McCaffrey finds Dan's location, he sends his men after him. During the trip, Kyle interacts with a fan who asks to take a picture with him. When Dan sees this, he questions Kyle about the photo. At the same time, McCaffrey's men locate Dan's car and begin their pursuit. Dan does everything he can to protect his family. He plays music in the car and communicates with Jessica and the kids, who were asleep. After an intense series of events, Max is thrilled by the adventure and claps with excitement. When the family wakes up, Nina tells them they're near her boyfriend's university and asks to visit him, but her mother refuses. Nina becomes very upset and insists on seeing her boyfriend, so Dan takes her to the university. There, Dan spots one of McCaffrey's men and intervenes to protect his family. He manages to take the man down and heads back to the car. Meanwhile, Nina visits her boyfriend but discovers he's cheating on her. She returns to the car in tears, but Dan comforts her and suggests she get revenge in a clever way that won't hurt her. Nina follows his advice, executes his plan, and returns to the car feeling triumphant. Later, Nina drives the car while Dan sits beside her, and Kyle and Jessica sleep in the back. Nina asks her father if he told her mom that she had quit her job. Dan replies that he hadn't, but she begins to consider going back to work. Dan encourages her to do so, telling her she's very talented and that he has read all of her articles. He assures her that both he and her mom are incredibly proud of her. And then they go to sleep at the hotel. When Augie talks to his friend who works in the passport office, his friend tells him that he should report them. Meanwhile, Dan tries to practice what he's going to say because he wants to tell Jessica the truth. That's when Kyle comes in and asks Dan, "Are you killed, boy? Why didn't you tell me?" Dan replies, "I was afraid for you because I wanted you to be a normal person." Kyle tells him that many people love him and says that he's not a social person but feels very happy when he's killed, boy. Kyle offers to play video games with Dan, suggesting that if Kyle wins, Dan has to agree to play video games with him. Dan agrees, and they start playing together. Kyle is surprised to see his dad understands the game, and in the end Dan wins. Kyle asks him how he got so good, and Dan tells him that he used to practice when he was young. Kyle expresses his happiness at playing with his dad. Dan continues the journey and arrives at the city they were traveling to. Afterward, they go to a very famous hotel and are delighted with the place. Dan meets Augie and takes the new passports from him. Augie asks him if he told them the truth, and Dan replies that he's going to tell Jessica during dinner. We then see Dan and Jessica going out to dinner together. Before leaving, Dan tells his kids not to leave the room. However, the kids don't listen, and while Dan and Jessica are out, they head to the video game arcade. There, they find many players and start playing with them. Dan is nervous during dinner, and every time he tries to tell Jessica the truth, something interrupts him. He starts worrying about the kids and calls them, but they don't answer. Dan and Jessica return to the hotel to find that the kids have put pillows under the covers to make it look like they're sleeping. Suddenly, men working for McCaffrey storm into the suite, but Dan manages to fight them off. However, one of the men grabs Jessica and threatens Dan with her life. Dan pleads with him to let Jessica go and take him instead, assuring him that she knows nothing. Jessica is shocked by what's happening. The man tells Dan he will kill him first, then Jessica, and let his men kill the kids in the arcade. Dan is stunned to learn that the kids left the hotel. Dan rushes to save his kids, fighting off the men and defeating them. Afterward, he gathers his family and begins explaining everything. He tells them that his real name is Sean, and that his mother died when he was 4 years old, leaving him with a violent father. When he turned 18, he joined the military, where he trained and became a dangerous person. While in the military, he met McCaffrey, a former Air Force general who trained him and recruited him into a team tasked with taking down corrupt individuals the police couldn't catch. Kyle becomes furious and says to Dan, You're selfish. You took away the one thing I love in life because of violence, even though it's not real, it's just games behind a screen. And now I've found out you're a liar and a killer. Dan is heartbroken and tells him that he did it because he was scared for him. Dan continues, saying he thought what he was doing with McCaffrey was right but later realized he was involved in the wrong things, which is why he decided to leave. Jessica, now angry, says, I've lived with you for 18 years without knowing anything about you. Now I understand why you didn't want to go out or travel, and why you kept the kids from using social media. Nina asks, what are we supposed to do now that they know where we are? Dan replies that he'll handle it, showing them the new passports and explaining that they can never return to their country again. Kyle gets angry and throws his passport, yelling at Dan that he's ruined everything. Nina storms out, saying, You have no right to do this to us. Jessica, also furious, tells Dan, You've destroyed our lives. This isn't about protecting us, it's about protecting yourself. Dan responds, I love you all, and I love my life with you. But Jessica doesn't believe him and tells him she's taking the kids and leaving in the morning. She calls Gwen to ask for her help. The next day, Jessica actually takes her kids and leaves. Dan tries to convince her that this decision is dangerous for them and won't work, but she refuses to listen. She goes to Gwen, who has arranged a private plane for her and her kids. Jessica thanks Gwen for her support and tells her that things have gone bad between her and Dan. Gwen responds, I also had a fight with my boyfriend. I loved him so much, but he suddenly left me, married another woman, and had kids with her. But I managed to reach her, became her friend, and even tricked her. Jessica feels uneasy, sensing that these words might be directed at her. She tells Gwen she wants to leave immediately, making up an excuse about forgetting something. But suddenly, McCaffrey appears in front of her. Gwen talks to McCaffrey and says, Take them, but I want Sean. McCaffrey deals with Dan and learns that his family is with him. He asks Dan to meet him at a specific location. Dan goes there, and the big surprise is that McCaffrey turns out to be Dan's biological father. McCaffrey starts talking, saying that when he left Dan and walked away, he was very angry with him and wanted to kill him. But now, after seeing how Dan defeated all the men he sent after him, he feels very proud of him. He asks Dan to come back and work with him again, but Dan refuses, explaining that he left that life behind for his family. McCaffrey replies, As you wish, but don't blame anyone else. He then orders Gwen to kill Jessica. Dan is forced to agree and retracts his decision to protect his family. McCaffrey orders his men to take Jessica and the kids to the airport to return to their country. As they leave, Kyle and Nina are heartbroken about leaving their dad. Dan tells them that he loves them and will always love them. Nina, feeling deeply upset, says, Dad is doing this for us. Can we really leave him like this? In the elevator, Jessica changes Max's diaper and accidentally bumps into Spiros, knocking him down from above. At that moment, she decides they must go back to help Dan. Meanwhile, Gwen tries to convince Dan to return to her, but he confronts her and twists her neck, causing her to pass out. Kyle helps his dad by watching over the area and giving him an earpiece for communication. Dan tells them to head to the roof to hide. McCaffrey becomes very nervous and sends his men to search for Sean. Kyle manages to help Dan, who eliminates all the men. Meanwhile, Gwen regains consciousness and fights Jessica, but Gwen proves stronger. After a tough struggle, Jessica manages to take down Gwen. At the same time, McCaffrey tries to overpower Dan but fails. Nina confronts her grandfather and says, Do you think my words will affect you? He replies, Not at all. She continues, I was just giving my dad a chance to finish you off. And that's exactly what happens. Dan defeats him, and the whole family rushes to him. The police arrive just in time, and McCaffrey is arrested. 6 months later, we learn that Nina, the journalist, helped the police bring McCaffrey down. Sean opens a training company to coach people, Jessica returns to sports, and Kyle resumes playing his favorite game. Their lives completely change, and they start traveling and enjoying their new life. And with that, our movie ends for today. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you liked the video.